very sensitive to the aspirations and the needs of different cultures that certainly weren't common to the community that I was born and raised in, because the community I was raised in, Mr. Speaker, for the most part, either you were Irish or you were Scotch, and that was about the extent of it. And so there was a certain convention or attitude that if you weren't Scotch or you weren't Irish, then you weren't a Cape Bretoner, which in reality, Mr. Speaker, that was so far from the truth, although many of the early forefathers that came to Cape Breton were either of Irish, Scotch, or French origin, as well as the Mi'kmaq community who preceded many of the immigrants that came from what we refer to as the old countries. But my second experience, Mr. Speaker, is with regards to the most unfortunate incident that happened back in the 1970s, and that was the death of one young gentleman by the name of Sandy Seal. And that was quite an emotional issue at that particular point in time. I was just graduating from high school, and simply put, Mr. Speaker, you could cut the air with a knife. The tenseness and the fear that permeated through the community, particularly at the high school level, where we felt we had a fairly interrelational, integrated community that where you respected people for who they were, from their hearts and their minds rather than from the color of their skin. And that experience was rather profound for anyone of my age group at that time, because I knew Sandy Seal, and I knew then Donald Marshall Jr. I knew his father very well. I felt that we were very good friends because he was one of the supporters in this native, non-native conference that took place, and he was one of the elders who participated and was a leader in that particular forum. So it was very heart-wrenching to watch two communities take this issue and exercise their frustration, their concern, their complete, I think, loss of innocence in both these communities, only to find out that in years past, that in fact it wasn't an issue of the native community versus the black community, but in fact, in large measure, as has been demonstrated through the Marshall Inquiry and considerable research some 10 years later, that there was considerable interference in the legal system from parties that really should not have been allowed to do what they did. There was also, I believe, to a certain extent, and I think that's where we as young people at that particular point in time, because I was only 17 at the time of that very tragic incident, and there was a considerable amount of racial profiling that went on. You didn't say it publicly. You didn't comment on it to the people that you spoke with in a group, but quietly, and I'm sure my colleague from Cape Breton Nova would certainly concur, that it was there. You could feel it. You could feel it, whether it be in the coffee shops, in the grocery stores, in the schools, in the churches. It was there, and it was very sad to see that it took more than 10 years for justice to be realized. And what a destruction and what a waste, all because, from my perspective, I felt that there was considerable racial profiling towards two minority groups that lived in this very special community of Cape Breton Island. Mr. Speaker, perhaps one of the most prominent public servants that we had in Cape Breton was a member of the African community, the black community. And he was a police officer for the city of Sydney, the former city of Sydney. I believe Phil Best. I know his last name was Best. I remember very well because I think he was the gentleman that gave me my first speeding ticket. And we became friends after that, not because of the speeding ticket, and not because I didn't try to wiggle out of the speeding ticket. When you're 17 and you think you know it all, you certainly take time to listen to your elders. And I had a tremendous respect for this particular individual. He was the very first police officer, black from the African community, black community, in Nova Scotia, if not further jurisdictions. I know he was perhaps one of the first in Nova Scotia. And he just passed away a little more than a year ago. And the number of friends and family and relatives, those who knew him personally, people in the community, those who didn't even know who he was, but they knew who he was by name, by reputation. He was perhaps one of the most well-respected police officers and citizens who did so much to advance issues from his community that I have ever witnessed. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that's something that's worth noting as well. Just recently, I had occasion to visit court in Old Toronto City Hall. I believe, Mr. Speaker, we were on a conference not too long ago, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and I took a half a day to visit the court system in Metro Toronto. And I was absolutely astounded at the number of court cases that were taking place. And as we can appreciate, it's a pretty large jurisdiction. We have several million people that live in and around the city of Toronto. I believe it's close to 10 million people, or maybe 3.2 in the inner core. But what I found most revealing about this whole experience was the rate at which cases were being processed and the number of individuals that appeared in court without legal defense. And what I found even more disturbing, Mr. Speaker, were the number of people from the black community, the African community, that seemed to be caught in the legal system. So I made that a bit of a preoccupation with myself, so I started going around and asking either police officers or members of the legal society, even ended up speaking with a judge on this particular issue. And finally, I came across this solicitor who was sitting on the steps of Old City Hall, and she was preparing for a case to defend, and she was, for the most part, a public defendant, or a legal lawyer for public defense. And I asked her about racial profiling, because I was rather struck with the high number of individuals that were caught in the legal system on serious criminal offenses. And she indicated to me that racial profiling was an issue that had been realized through a public commission, a study that was carried out. And it demonstrated quite clearly that even in the courts, even the police officers, the judges, and the prosecuting office from different jurisdictions, they know that racial profiling is an issue, but they don't do anything about it. And I found that very disturbing. Now, I haven't been able to she gave me reference reference benchmarks to secure that information. I haven't been able to do that at this point. But I think it speaks to a very serious issue, Mr. Speaker, the issue of racial profiling in the province of Nova Scotia. And I do believe that still goes on till this very day, perhaps not to the extent that it does in larger jurisdictions, larger metropolitan, multicultural areas of the country, but I still do believe it's there in very subtle form. But we in the province of Nova Scotia, we've come a long way since politicalization of the legal system during the 1980s, the 70s and 80s. That Royal Commission regarding the Donald Marshall case clearly demonstrated that there was considerable political interference into the legal system of Nova Scotia. And, well, it clearly did, and new novice members may want to read the transcripts of the Royal Commission, because that was a major concern, that we had interference of the legal system via the political process. Now, more in particular on this particular piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, as the minister had made his comments during his opening remarks, introduction on second reading, and then I listened to my colleague from Preston, who made reference to the fact that in some way that perhaps the minister is raising the issue of segregation in a way that perhaps was not intended or perhaps not wanted. During the oil rush of the 1980s, when the federal government, under the Honourable Pierre Trudeau at the time, signed an agreement with the then Premier of the province, the Honourable John Buchanan, for some $250 million, I would say, maybe more, for infrastructure to prepare Nova Scotia for this great wealth that we were going to find ourselves in. The future was here, I believe. The future is here was the great campaign slogan of the day. But what happened, Mr. Speaker? What happened was that the government took these hundreds of millions of dollars and spent them in areas of the province that had very little or nothing to do with the infrastructure in preparation for the offshore of Nova Scotia. However, there were some subtle and somewhat long-term benefits to the error of their ways. And I will give you one example. It's referred to as Cole Harbour Place in Dartmouth. Memorial. Exactly. Money that was taken to provide infrastructure for communities in preparation for the offshore was used to put a swimming pool in Dartmouth in the Minister of Health's riding. Now, that having been said, and all the errors that took place, Cole Harbour Place is a very vital and very successful piece of infrastructure for that community. Absolutely. Now, to speak to the particular piece of legislation at hand, the communities of Cherrybrook and Loon Lake, the residents from these communities, who were very keen on dismissing some of the myths and the apprehensions and the phobias about racial issues in the province of Nova Scotia, were very key and active participants in the development of this particular initiative. And for that, I compliment them. I have to wonder, Mr. Speaker, if the minister in some way is casting a shadow over that. I would hope not. And I have to, again, go back to the point that I premised before, that I am somewhat naive in some of these ultra-sensitive issues because of the reasons that I've given at the outset, coming back from a very small, rural, and somewhat isolated community on the provincial and national stage. And I believe the minister can appreciate where I'm coming from. But the question you have to ask is the minister doing justice by allowing this parallel approach to racial relations to develop? And maybe it's not. And I really have to submit to greater wisdom and knowledge on that. But I haven't heard it come from the minister at this point as to what the rationale, what the basis, and who are the proponents. Because any time a piece of legislation comes before this House, Mr. Speaker, there's always a reason. There's always as I always say, it's not what you see, it's not what you hear, it's what you don't see and what you don't hear that sometimes has the greatest impact, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask the Minister, perhaps when he's closing remarks, to speak to that particular issue. As well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's an opportunity to raise the issue about the provincial government's nominee program here in the province of Nova Scotia. And to date, quite frankly, it has been a dismal failure because the government has not made immigration a priority for the province or for the people of Nova Scotia, for the economy, for the culture, for the long-term growth of this province, in whatever way you choose to measure. We, as a province, have one of the lowest retention rates of any jurisdiction in Canada. And recently we've had representation from the Minister of Economic Development's office with regards to this particular issue. And what's most disturbing, Mr. Speaker, because immigration does tie in on the issue of race relations and how we can become a more diverse and a more healthy, multicultural society and understand the issues of not just the black community, the Native community, the Italian community, the Ukrainian community, or whatever. But, Mr. Speaker, we only have one staff member in that entire department to manage a 5-year agreement. One full-time staff. Is it little wonder that we have one of the lowest retention rates? Is it little wonder that we are losing out to provinces like Manitoba? Is it little wonder that when immigrants come to Halifax, and perhaps even less so to rural Nova Scotia, they want to move on to Montreal, to Toronto, to Ottawa, to Vancouver? Because the government has been a dismal failure on this particular issue. So I would encourage the Minister, who's sponsoring this particular piece of legislation, to sit down and collaborate with his colleague from Economic Development and realize the benefits to the economy and to the social structure of this province. Mr. Speaker, I know the Minister means well, otherwise he wouldn't have introduced this particular piece of legislation. Surely a minister wouldn't introduce legislation to propagate the errors and sins of omission of the past. I don't believe that for a moment. But we have to be careful not to do it unwittingly, just to satisfy one particular interest group, irregardless of what community it represents, what cultural entity. Mr. Speaker, I think that's extremely, extremely important. One of the biggest flaws, Mr. Speaker, in this entire nominee program, I believe, from what I've been able to witness, is that the government hires consultants. Now, the consultants get paid on a piecemeal basis. We haven't been able to ascertain, the breakdown of who's getting what for this here. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, the emphasis for government through this program to date has been through the business sector, not from the labor component, not from the specialized skills, socially, culturally, and from an educational point of view, in so many ways that our province can be rich. Mr. Speaker, one of the final issues I would like to address as well is with regards to the employment equity programs that we have, as well as the representation from our minority groups on various agencies, boards and commissions in the province of Nova Scotia. It's an opportunity for the Minister to flag that particular issue, particularly at the human resources level within the public service, because I do believe there has been some considerable gains and strides made to that, not just in terms of gender equity, but also in terms of ensuring that minorities are represented on different agencies, boards, and commissions, some 330 or so within the province of Nova Scotia. So I do believe, Mr. Speaker, it's an opportunity for the Minister to collaborate not just with the Minister of Economic Development, but also the Minister of Human Resources, who, to a certain extent, has not given full detailed analysis on this particular issue. Although I will recognize all three ministers for giving focus and a sense of urgency to this particular issue. With regards to the employment equity programs, for the most part, these are driven by the federal government. And in recent years, particularly the last 2 to 3 years, the provincial government has backed off and allowed the federal government to be the lead agent on this particular issue. And I think that's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate to the residents in the Preston area, to the Whitney-Pear area, and a number of other communities across the province of Nova Scotia. And yes, even in many of the native communities, which for the most part are the purview of the federal government, but for various reasons have become somewhat integrated into the provincial level. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll conclude my remarks, and I would certainly encourage this bill going on to law amendments for further approbation. I would suspect that some amendments would be forthcoming, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this bill.
Thank you. Recognize the Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to take a moment to thank those members opposite who participated in the debate and provided some helpful interventions. As well, I want to take an opportunity to further clarify some of the issues raised during debate. First of all, with respect to the budget, members are inaccurate to describe the budget as being only $400,000. In fact, the budget actually only covers a portion of the calendar year, so therefore it couldn't accurately be described at $400,000. With respect to the number of employees, currently, as I indicated in my opening remarks, there are 2 people who have been seconded to this new office to help develop the office and help structure it. The 2 people have worked very hard over the past number of months, 10, 11 months, but those 2 people are staff who have been brought in to help develop this office. It's envisioned that the office, when it's fully operational and has reached its full scope, will be significantly more than that. In fact, if you look at the budget documents that were presented in last spring's budget, this year we expect to have 7 people by the end of the year actually working for and with the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs. That's just to correct that issue. With respect to the title of Deputy Minister, CEO, in Nova Scotia, offices of or secretariats of government traditionally have the title of CEO. In this case, although that person who will hold that office will be the CEO, they will be at a deputy minister's level and will be sitting at the same table as other deputy ministers and will be able to provide advice to government the same as other deputy ministers. It's a structure that we have here in Nova Scotia for all such offices, and if you look across the board, what you'll see is other offices like Acadian Affairs, Aboriginal Affairs, Senior Citizen Secretariat, Status of Women. Those types of offices all have the same or similar structures within them. One of the things that was brought up by the member for Preston was with respect to the office's work as it relates to economic development. I want to point out to the House and to all Nova Scotians, one of the things that I did very early on was make it a point to go out and consult with groups and organizations. And one of the things that I heard over and over and over again that they didn't want this office to do is to repeat work that's already being done by other groups and organizations. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, and all Nova Scotians that on September 5th, 2003, I met with VANSTA, the Valley African Nova Scotia Economic Development Group. On the 19th, I met in Claymore with the Partnership of Black Employment Partnership Committee. I also met with similar organizations in Upper Hammonds Plains, in Lucasville, in Antigonish, in New Glasgow, in Guysborough, in Cape Breton Regional Municipality, as well in the valley, throughout the valley, and down in Digby, as well in the Yarmouth area. Over and over and over again, the common theme they said is that HRDC is doing good work in certain areas. We don't want you and the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs to duplicate that work. Your role is to ensure that they continue to do that work and advocate on our behalf, and that's exactly how we've structured this office. With respect to issues raised around municipal boundaries, there have been issues brought to my attention around municipal boundaries, not by the member for Preston, but by others, and there is a process in place in the province of Nova Scotia to deal with that through a judicial process, through a committee established by the province of Nova Scotia and municipalities to develop these boundaries, and people have expressed their concerns to that process, and there is a legal entity that deals with that, and that will be dealt with in due course through the implementation of the law as it relates to that. I understand the concerns raised by those folks in Cherrybrook, Lake Loon, and I expect that those concerns will be heard and addressed by the appropriate body. In fact, I continue and will continue to provide advice and advocacy on behalf of those folks when and where necessary, and I think that at least from our perspective, the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs is just beginning the work that we have before us. There are many, many issues that have been brought to my attention, and I understand completely and fully that we aren't going to be able to deal with all of them all at once. But what I can say is that we will work as closely as we possibly can with the communities. We'll bring their interests to government, and we'll ensure that many of these issues that have been raised here today, and to me personally as I visited communities and individuals, will receive the kind of attention that they deserve with a government like ours. That's the reason we brought forward this piece of legislation today. That's the reason we decided to establish this Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs, because those reports have been established and prepared for government, and action hasn't taken place, and we believe it's time, as the member for Halifax Needham pointed out, to dust off those reports and get to work. And that's why I'm so pleased that today we'll be able to see this piece of legislation move forward so we can move on to the next step of our work. Other issues that have been brought to this floor, we've been actively involved with, including issues surrounding Africville, and I want to say to members here today and to all Nova Scotians that it's been through interventions of the two staff that we have in the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs and myself that we've been able to begin a dialogue process that involves the federal government and the municipal government and ourselves in hopefully finding a resolution to this long-standing dispute between residents of Africville, former residents of Africville, and the Halifax Regional Municipality. So in these closing remarks, I want to thank the members opposite, particularly the member for Halifax Needham, for her helpful interventions. I want to look forward to this piece of legislation moving through the committee and then finally through the legislature. I want to point out to members here that we will continue to do the work that we've done, and I anticipate in very short order we'll be able to bring forward to members' attention the business plan and the scope of the work that we intend to do, as well as begin the process of ramping up our staff so it enables me as minister to move these issues, these important issues forward, so that as a legislature and as a province and as a government and as a society we're able to act upon these very real and important issues for African Nova Scotians. Thank you very much, and I close debate on Bill number 101.
Thank you. Motion is for second reading on Bill 101. Is House ready for the question? Would all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye? Aye. Contrary minded? Motion is carried.
Bill 101, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 376 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Service Act, to establish the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs.
I order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under Public Bills for second reading, it's called Bill number 103, the Regulation Act.
Number 103. I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise briefly to speak to this bill. Mr. Speaker, this bill is fundamentally about modernizing the law with respect to regulations in Nova Scotia. And I'd like to acknowledge that we have today in the House, in the East Gallery, the Registrar of Regulations, Jonathan Davies, and I'd ask Jonathan to stand for the benefit of the House. Jonathan and his team at the Registry of Regulations have done an outstanding job. And they have done an outstanding job of really bringing our regulations and the accessibility of those regulations into the 21st century. Because as a result of the work they've done over a number of years, those the regulations are accessible to Nova Scotians over the internet. People can check the regulations of, which are unofficial at the moment, but hopefully with this bill's passage will become official. And they can check those regulations, and they're revised on a continual basis. And the purpose of this bill is largely to allow us to make that electronic version of the regulations as an official version of the regulations in the same way that the paper record is an official version. And for example, it'll allow Nova Scotians, when this project is complete in 2006, it will allow Nova Scotians to check the regulations, and they'll be official and for use in court and those kind of purposes. But they will also have the capacity so that if somebody wants to check the regulations and find out what the regulations were in 2004, for example, to see how the law as described in those regulations differed, they'll be able to call up a version of the regulations, that I understand it, that would provide that information. So it will be a very useful tool to Nova Scotians who have a question about regulations, which really, of course, are a form of delegated legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope members are able to support the bill. I think it is an effort to, again, improve accessibility for the legal process in Nova Scotia, and I hope they can support the bill and move it on for second reading and to law amendments. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move second reading.
Recognize the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to speak for a couple of minutes on this legislation. I and my caucus do support this legislation. It's technical in nature, probably only affects to any great extent the legal community and their access to regulations online. I think it will make it a lot more helpful for the legal community and others who need to access regulations. I know myself and I know others in the, whether they sit in this House or as lawyers, sometimes have difficulty accessing it. Obviously, going to the library is an option, but now having them online as the true legal form will make it a lot easier, I think. And I don't think, I don't expect a groundswell of people showing up at law amendments for this legislation. You never know. But I look forward to hearing comments on it. The one point I did make when I was briefed on this earlier, Mr. Speaker, was just around security. Once you put formal regulations online, you have to guarantee the security of it, because much like a chain of evidence, judges take judicial notice of regulations because you make a photocopy of it. The assumption is that it's recognized as the right one. I just want to make sure, and I'm sure the government can assure us, that security will be foremost in their mind to ensure that when regulations are put online, they can't be altered in some way that would eventually result in questioning of what is being presented to the courts. So with that one caveat, I look forward to law amendments on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for bringing this piece of legislation forward. I think, as the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage has already indicated, most of the changes that are being suggested with respect to this piece of legislation are technical. They are welcome. However, there are some, and one piece in particular that may require some additional discussion between ourselves and the Minister and perhaps members of government or officials in government, just to ensure that the language is plain and straightforward. There is a new provision with respect to making regulations retroactive in this legislation. I see the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage nod his head, and perhaps some of what I might say would reflect what he's already thought about with respect to this. And I'd like to first comment about the specifics with respect to this piece of legislation, and then comment more generally about the role that regulations play vis-a-vis our work here in the legislature. The language around Section 6 that has been put in place, and we'll have an opportunity in a more appropriate forum to discuss the specific language, is unclear in some respects. Perhaps if there were some opportunity to make it clearer, then we could find that through some mutual agreement. If that happens in discussions, then we welcome it. My understanding is that the intent of that section is to ensure that we can make regulations retroactive to the day that they were originally passed in Cabinet. And the policy around that is something that our caucus would like to have an opportunity to hear from Nova Scotians on and have discussions about. We want to make sure that we understand fully what the implications of those changes are. But I think it's important at this time to understand fully what regulations are and where regulations stand in relation to the work that we do here in the legislature. Under majority governments, it's common for a cabinet to undertake activities that really don't require the same level of support in the House that they might otherwise. We're in a unique situation with a minority government. And by that, I'm saying that we, in a minority situation, there is, I would suggest, a greater obligation on the part of the governing party to reflect the will of all of the parties. And what that means is that Cabinet in particular can't, on its own decree, decide what the laws of the province of Nova Scotia should be. And I would suggest that there are two examples that have been troubling over the last year or so. The most obvious example, and the one that received the greatest attention, is the one, Mr. Speaker, related to the Insurance Act. I don't want to go down the road of repeating the history of what happened with respect to that piece of legislation. It was certainly, as the leader of the official opposition is saying, it was a sad history, and I would echo those comments, frankly, because it was an unfortunate turn of events with respect to the regulations fundamentally changing after there was a clear understanding of what they were intended to be in the first place. And the complaints that I registered on the record was that that circumvents the authority of this body. It is this body that has the final authority over the laws of this province, and it's this body that gets elected by the people of Nova Scotia. The second example is one that has received less attention, and I think over the course of this sitting, we will have an opportunity to have discussed in greater detail, and that's the recent whistleblower regulations that came forward. I again see the nodding of the leader of the official opposition, where I think they would recognize that the whistleblower regulations coming forward as regulations and not as legislation was a clear mistake, and it appears to be an effort to circumvent the authority of this body. We have a number of changes that we feel would be appropriate and not offensive to the government in this matter. That would provide a greater balance to the whistleblower legislation whistleblower regulations that have been put forward. Perhaps the government would be open and amenable to some of the suggestions that we would make and the NDP would make with respect to that. We feel that the regulations have holes in them right now, and if they were in legislation, think of the opportunity that we would have. We would have the opportunity for the Nova Scotians who are affected by this to appear before law amendments and provide their additional input, because certainly all the answers to the problems in Nova Scotia can't be answered by the parties on any of the three sides that we have here before us. Opening the door of the law amendments procedure to allow Nova Scotians to say, this is what I think about these or one provision or another of the whistleblower legislation, if it were that, would give that piece of legislation the legitimacy that legislation deserves. By bypassing that process, we end up with a substandard set of rules and less legitimacy. If the government is serious about opening up the doors of the opportunity for people within government to speak their mind and to provide an open disclosure of problems that exist in government, then surely The way to do that would be to consult with the opposition parties to come forward with legislation that is amenable to all parties and ultimately has the approval of Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, the overarching comment that I would make with respect to these changes to the regulations is that we want to determine clearly what is the intention and what are the implications of that intention. And secondly, we want to ensure that government knows that Nova Scotians will be asking them hard questions about whether or not they respected the principles around a minority government by bringing forward legislation that is on its face clear to all the people of Nova Scotia and ensures that the people of Nova Scotia know for sure what it is that our lawmakers are doing and that it's not happening behind closed doors. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry. The honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Wow. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, this discussion has taken an interesting turn. I think that we've heard comments from representatives of all three of the parties, and interestingly enough and appropriately enough, in a minority government situation, all three parties have said things that have merit and are correct. We heard from the minister that his officials had done good work in preparing the new scheme for the electronic form of regulations, and that's correct. And we heard from my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage that the question of security of the system is important and cannot be overlooked if we adopt this legislation, because there's an implied promise to the users of the system that indeed all due scrutiny, all due care has been taken in assembling the electronic form of the regulations. And we heard a warning from the member for Halifax Citadel that regulations in a minority government situation have a potential to be problematic. These are all very good points. And I want to talk, if I may, just a little bit about the last point that was made about whether minority government actually does imply some change in the regulation-making obligations of a government. It's a very interesting point. Now, a government does not have any inherent right to make regulations. It's simply not part of what comes automatically along with having been elected to be a government, whether it's a majority or minority. Regulation-making power is something that is granted only by this legislature after a bill goes through. When a bill goes through, it may add a power to the government, to the governor and council, to the cabinet, to enact regulations pursuant to that particular piece of legislation. So there's no inherent power. That has to be a power that's granted by this House to the government. And yet, of course, many of the bills that have granted the government a regulation-making power will have been passed during a time when there's a majority government in place. And the power essentially is one that the government, the majority government in power for the moment, has essentially given itself. Now, what I think is important is that indeed, yes, just as a government in a minority situation that comes to this House has to persuade at least one of the opposition parties to support a legislative measure that goes through, otherwise it won't go through. What is the situation with respect to regulations when a minority government has the power, granted at some earlier stage, to enact regulations? Now, I suggest that although there's nothing illegal about it, because that power, once on the books, is granted, that power is a power that can be exercised by a government regardless of whether it's a majority or minority. I think we've been warned about something, and I think we've been warned by the member from Halifax Citadel that we should be particularly careful in a minority government situation with every bill that comes through now in which the government asks to be given a regulation-making power. We should be especially careful when those are extensive powers And I have to say, there are a couple of bills that are in front of the House right now, having been introduced by the government, in which they are asking for exactly that. They're asking for very extensive regulation-making powers, as if they were a majority government giving them to themselves. I think we have to be very careful when we see those kinds of provisions coming in legislation before us now in a minority government situation. But let's go back to the other situation, one in which a minority government, the cabinet, sits using a piece of legislation that has given itself, gives regulation-making power, but passed at some earlier time. How are we to react as opposition parties to something like that? We have no power inherently to stop it. It's not as if a regulation has to come to this House. It doesn't. But you know, they're part of the public record. A government cannot enact regulations in secret. The status of a regulation is of the same status of laws as if passed by this House. They are of full force and effect. They are part of the laws of the province of Nova Scotia. So I think that the minister should think and remind his colleagues that there will be scrutiny by the opposition parties in a minority situation of any regulations that are put in place by the government under any legislation, and that they will be held to the same kind of standard as if they were bills that had been brought to this House. So indeed, that's one of the consequences of a minority government. It's a very interesting point. We're certainly supportive of this legislation, but it draws our attention to a very interesting part of the dynamics of minority government. And I'd like to thank the minister and thank him for the opportunity for speaking to this.
Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South. Cape Breton West, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be very brief on this particular piece of legislation, much to the chagrin of the members of the NDP caucus. But, Mr. Speaker, I hadn't contemplated on speaking on this until I listened to the last speaker, because unlike his colleague from Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage, who suggested in his remarks that this particular piece of legislation was only an issue of housekeeping matter and that, quote, would only affect lawyers. That was the first thing that twigged my interest, because for that member to suggest that public legislation only affects lawyers, that makes me quite concerned. And then his colleague from Halifax Shabukto stands up and raises the conspiracy theory about what the government is trying to pull off here.
You usually do that.
Oh, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they certainly are moving to center ground. But, Mr. Speaker, my colleague from Halifax Citadel has pointed out quite clearly the issue of the retroactivity, and it's a very important matter. But I think what's not stated here is the powers that are being given to the Registrar of Regulations. In fact, that entire title has been converted into the Regulations Reviser, with considerable authority to be able to change the regulations as per his interpretation or her interpretation as he or she sees fit. And that the minister would certainly concur, because that's outlined on page 2, section 5 of the regulations, subsection 2, A, B, and C. So, Mr. Speaker, this is not, as the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage has suggested, just a housekeeping matter. This is a fundamental shift in the way we allow the regulations for the province of Nova Scotia to be articulated and interpreted and revised. And in some cases, if I'm interpreting this correctly, Mr. Speaker, they may not even have to go back to Cabinet. The registrar will now have the ability to put his or her interpretation as to what Cabinet is stating. And it's right there in the regulations, or in the section of the Act. So I do believe that this is warranted going for public scrutiny at law amendments, but I do believe that there should be a little more detail provided other than the kind of little huffy and puffy and light-hearted disposition of the Minister of Justice saying this is only a housekeeping measure, supported by the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, contradicted by his colleague from Halifax Chebucto, espousing the conspiracy theory, tempered by the wisdom of the member for Halifax Citadel. But Mr. Speaker,
Order.
Mr.
Member
Speaker,
for Cape Breton West has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, we know what's happened on a previous day when the minister didn't get his matters in order. And that certainly became evident in the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia in February of 2002, when the law that he proclaimed came in after the regulations had been proclaimed. In other words, the regulations were ultra-virus to the Act. They went to Supreme Court. Mr. Speaker, we had regulations to an act that didn't exist legally, for those who want a layman's interpretation. So I would hope that this particular amendment is not an opportunity to correct what this minister has already put in error, but perhaps some other issues that members of this legislature is not familiar with. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would certainly rely on some of the experience and the information that I have, rather than the waxed eloquence or less than eloquence of the member for Cape Breton Centre, who I haven't seen dare into this conversation, and with justification, I can dare say. But Mr. Speaker, with that particular point having been made, I'll certainly be supporting this going on to law amendments. I don't like to argue with him.
Seeing no more speakers, I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice to close debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate all the interventions of most of the interventions of the honourable members. I can indicate on a more serious note that I've indicated to members that the Registrar of Regulations would be available to discuss issues around language and explanations of what the intent of the legislation is, because I do appreciate that the language in this bill is quite arcane, and would very much offer to any member who wants an opportunity to discuss the language to make sure that everybody's comfortable with it, because this is not really an attempt by the government to garner new powers for itself. This is not the spirit in which this bill was intended, I can assure you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, this is again an issue where staff had identified a need, and we're trying to bring that forward. I should also say, by way of a note, that I think something that we do need to look at in Nova Scotia, though, at some point in the near future, is revision of our statutes. Because statute revision makes the statutes much more accessible to the public. And unfortunately, when the statutes are a long time since revision, people are oftentimes caught, as members would be aware, trying to look at the statute and 20 amending statutes over the last 20 years and deciphering them sequentially, and that is oftentimes problematic. So I think that a bigger chore, which will require some more public resources, but which is one that we should continue to think about, is the need for revision of the general statutes of the province in some very near future date. With that, I'll ask the move second reading the bill, and look forward to further discussion with members of the House at law amendments.
13. The motion is for second reading on Bill 103. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Contrary minded? Motion carried.
Bill 103, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 393 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Regulations Act.
Order that the bill be referred to the Committee of Law Amendments. Recognize the Honourable Government Deputy House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Speaker. Public bills for second reading. I'd like to continue debate on Bill number 64.
Continue debate on Bill number 64. The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a continuation of this debate on this bill, which I left off with a little while ago. I couldn't help, though, but notice the speaker directly before me, the member from Cape Breton West, of course, was talking about something relevant to this bill, I think. But every time he speaks, it always reminds me of that famous Yogi Berra saying, you know, it gets later much earlier this time of the season. Mr. Speaker, it is ironic, though, that this particular bill follows directly on the heels of the Regulations Act, because indeed some of what the member from Halifax-Sidney was talking about and the member from Halifax-Shabukta was talking about resides directly in this bill. This bill, as I pointed out previously, Mr. Speaker, is essentially just a shell, and I think the member for Halifax-Clayton Park pointed that out as well. This is a shell piece of legislation which essentially encompasses the powers which the government would then use in order to determine the makeup, the authority, the powers of the district transportation authority. And I don't have to tell you that this is, or potentially is, a very, very dangerous thing to do. We have, once this act passes this House and passes into law, we lose all control, we lose all ability to hold the government accountable for the decisions that it's going to make that are going to affect the people of the district, which, frankly, in my caucus, many of our caucus members represent. So it's a matter of particular and considerable concern to the members of this caucus. And I want to draw, a number of points out here, and I guess I'll start with the whole question of whether or not the composition of the District Transportation Authority as it's imagined through this act is even appropriate. Because, what is really clear is that this is meant to be an authority which will essentially have members from the municipal level and from the provincial level. And I think, predominantly those are anticipated to be municipal level appointees, either from staff or elected or appointed from the community at large. They would have the bulk of the appointees, and then the provincial government likely would have a couple of staff appointees who would act as a resource for the Transportation Authority. One, it begs the question, Mr. Speaker, where is the participation of the federal government in this? The federal government is a substantial player in the municipality of Halifax. They have some very large assets. I mean, namely, the port is one that you can just think of. They certainly have national defense here in Halifax, and really many other assets. Of course, they also have responsibility for things like the railway. They also have responsibility for the airport, and these all are significant transportation links that make up part of the infrastructure of the district, of the proposed district, and yet there is nothing in the Act that provides for the participation of the federal government. Now, this seems to me to be a major oversight of the legislation. They're not called upon to participate. I suppose it's possible that the municipality could use up one of their nominees to nominate somebody from the federal government, but that's really going at it at a very kind of tangential way, rather than providing for that participation within the body of the Act. So I want to say, first of all, that I think is a concern which ought to be a concern of all of us here, that one of the major stakeholders, one of the major partners in the transportation picture in this province, and particularly in the district that is anticipated to be part of this transportation authority, isn't even there. So I have to say that is a pretty peculiar and I think pretty significant reservation that we would certainly have with this. Now, I want to address another piece of this, because I have certainly heard from people who have raised the question of why is it that we wouldn't want a district planning authority around transportation. And I'd like to address that question head on, because it misunderstands the debate on this bill. It is not the case that we don't want a regional planning body that would look at transportation areas for the metropolitan area. Of course we do. We would like to see, in fact, that such a planning authority or such a planning body would be one of an overall transportation plan for the province of Nova Scotia. There could be, and perhaps justifiably, many regional planning bodies with respect to transportation that would, in total, look at the province's transportation strategy. I can't but help but think that if there is an overall transportation plan for this province, there are many people out there who would love to see it, not the least of which would be Cape Breton. I mean, we have significant transportation issues on the table in the municipality of Cape Breton, not the least of which is, of course, with respect to the application to abandon the railway. So it is not the case that we are in any way opposed to regional planning for the purposes of ensuring that we have an appropriate transportation net. That's not the case at all. What we are concerned about is that whatever we are going to approve as a matter of legislation in this House is appropriate, provides representation that will serve the interests and the needs of all of our constituents. These are the kinds of concerns, Mr. Speaker, that we're trying to deal with. And I think that, if we were dealing with another area of the province, if it was in Colchester County or in Cumberland County, and we were looking at setting up a transportation authority that was going to deal with those, that the members from those areas would absolutely be concerned to make sure that all of the appropriate stakeholders, whether they are community or whether they are governmental, are there at the table to ensure that the best possible result comes forward from that planning process. So I wanted to make those points as a kind of an entry point into this discussion, because of course there are I think many other things that we have to be concerned about. I know that I've kind of given short shrift to the point that I started out with, which is that the Regulations Act being discussed, and here we are with a bill that essentially asks us to give power over into regulations to the government. And my intention is to come back to that a little later on. But I want to draw on a particular example of a concern that I would have. My constituency is in Cole Harbour, and of course, in order to get here, I travel back and forth daily on one of the two bridges, which get me here in time to participate in these kinds of debates, Mr. Speaker. And though that infrastructure is provided for and is maintained and is planned, the maintenance is planned for by a standalone agency, the Halifax Dartmouth Bridge Commission. Now, what they do is they generate money from a toll, and that toll, that money, that revenue that they generate is then used to provide for the maintenance of those two assets. And of course, they bear in mind when they're making sure of that maintenance, they are essentially charged with the responsibility of looking after the safety of the people who travel on the bridge, the customers of the Bridge Commission, and the staff who work there and who provide service to their customers. So they are dedicated to that particular job, looking after those two major assets, and I believe they are the entry point onto the peninsula for something like 40% of the population of the regional municipality of Halifax. So not insignificant number of people who get into the peninsula by using those two assets. Now, there is a debate that goes on in this province. It's gone on for a long time. In fact, it's going on across North America wide about the whole question of tolls. And I know that the former Liberal government brought in the Cobequid Pass, and that was a substantial amount. There was a substantial level of debate in the affected counties. And if you look at politically at those seats at that time, I believe they were all represented by Liberals at the time, and I don't think there's any Liberals representing those seats now. Right? So I think it is fair to say, and I'm not talking about the rightness or wrongness of it. I'm just simply saying that it appears as if these kinds of decisions around tolls can have a significant political reverberation that shows up in subsequent elections. That's just what the way it appears to me. Maybe there were many other factors, perhaps the particular desirability of the candidates in those ridings was part of the factor that turned them to another party. I don't know, and I'm not trying to be to guess or second guess the voters in those constituencies. I'm simply saying that that was part of the debate that took place. And that's taken place not only in this province, as I've said, across the country, North America wide, and indeed probably worldwide. Are tolls the best way to pay for infrastructure? But even if you believe that tolls are indeed the best way to pay for them, in this province we have a toll that is designed to pay for the maintenance and the safety of those two particular assets. If you fold those assets into an authority that then has a much broader responsibility, so that those tolls then go to pay for whatever it is that the authority goes to looks after, then that toll simply stops being a dedicated toll and starts to be a tax. That's what it is. It loses its character as a toll, and it becomes a tax where the money is used for the general application among the assets of the authority of the district. So this is another consideration I think that we must consider, because somewhere the new transportation authority is going to have a revenue stream. So are we prepared to say that and what is the effect on those tolls? I mean, if that district authority needs a revenue stream, and if the toll revenue is being used generally to pay for the assets of the district transportation authority, what is to stop a new district transportation authority from raising the tolls on the assets they have in order to pay for other non-related pieces of infrastructure? Because at that point, Mr. Speaker, as abusive as some people feel that tolls are, it becomes very abusive at that point, because it's clearly being used as an alternative to taxation, and it's being used in a what I would assume most members here would consider to be an inappropriate fashion. So that is the kind of thing that when you're considering whether or not you want to turn over carte blanche, the regulatory power, to the government, are we comfortable that we should be turning over the authority to be able to do that kind of thing? Now, essentially, the government has been without comment on this. We have received some a small amount of information about the negotiations that are taking place between the province and the municipality, and certainly we've been following the debate in the newspaper as we've seen the various municipal officials comment on it, but we certainly have exacted no guarantees from the provincial government about what their intentions are with respect to these regulations. And so, I hate to dredge this out of the closet, as it were, Mr. Speaker, but we have seen the regulations that came forward, proposed regulations under the Insurance Act. We have seen what happened to those. We have seen the implementation of new regulations, ones that certainly didn't appear before this body. We have seen, as was pointed out, the whole question of the regulations under the Whistleblowers Act, and unfortunately, there are considerable concerns about those. In fact, I might go so far as to say, were those things to come before this House, you would find that there would have been significant objections on this side of the House to many of those things that were done. As I said, I don't like to dredge this out of the closet, but the reality is, why should we believe you now? Why should we believe you now? On numerous occasions, you've had regulatory power, which you have exercised in a manner which we feel is inappropriate. So why should we, just as a matter of principle, why should we turn over to you a whole new set of powers through regulation? I haven't had that explained to me, and I don't think that the members who represent, especially the members who represent the urban area in this legislature, have had that adequately explained to them. Why it is that we should believe you now when it comes to the regulations that you would enact under the Transportation Authority for the Capital Region. We're not trying to be petulant about this. We're not trying to be obstinate. We're not trying to be obstructionist. And I hope that the government members understand, in the same way that the member for Colchester-Muscatawba Valley, or in the same way that the member for Guysborough would do their best to represent their particular constituents, we are attempting to make sure that our constituents, the members of the communities in our constituencies, are going to be properly served by this piece of legislation. And I've got to say again, Mr. Speaker, at this point, I am just thoroughly unconvinced because I haven't seen anything through the office of the minister on this that would lead me to believe that it's anything more than a power grab on behalf of the government, who's simply saying to us, you pass this act and then we'll do what we want. Well, in these circumstances, I mean, that may I don't think it was ever fine. I'm not going to say, well, that may be fine, because it was never fine. It wasn't fine when you had a majority, and it's certainly not fine now. And the difference, of course, Mr. Speaker, is if the government wants to find a way to get this kind of legislation through the House of Assembly, it is going to have to pay attention to the objections made by the member from Halifax-Clayton Park, the member from Halifax-Citadel, and the members on our caucus, so that we can reach some kind of an accommodation and understanding about what the impact of this is going to be on our respective constituents. We have not seen, I guess I'll move along a little bit on this, we have not seen anything from the Department of Transportation and Public Works that would tell us what the arrangement is going to be for the transfer of any assets from the provincial government and associated bodies like the Bridge Commission to the municipality, if that was going to happen. Now, this makes me a little bit suspicious, and I think for good reason. I'll go back to the bridges because they're the ones that are certainly the symbol to many people. The minister, the speaker may know, I certainly know, that there are examples of bad decisions that have been made across North America with respect to assets like bridges when they become part of a broad transportation authority. And one I can think of is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, which is a toll bridge. And I believe that financing of that bridge is through a transportation authority of sorts. There's not a dedicated standalone bridge authority there. They are part of a wider asset base. Well, what happened, Mr. Speaker, is those assets were used in one fashion or another, either as a revenue stream or were used to finance capital, which was then used for purposes beyond the actual bridges themselves. So I'm told that at this point, the cost of tolls on those on that bridge is somewhere in the vicinity of $5 or $6, and that it is carrying significant debt, and that they're looking at further increases, simply because of the way in which that was managed. Now, my question, of course, would be, well, if you intend to turn over assets like the Bridge Commission's asset, the two bridges, what is it that the provincial government is going to get in return? I mean, these are assets, right?
Good question.
So surely they're not just going to say, we're going to turn these over to the Capital District Transportation Authority, no charge, you'll carry whatever debt's on there and get the revenue. I don't believe that for a second. My assumption would be that the Minister of Transportation and Public Works and the government would be looking for fair market value for those assets. They would be looking for a price, Mr. Speaker. And obviously, they would want to take that money in. I would assume it would make up, as it has in the past with various assets, would make up part of what they would use in general revenue. Certainly they did that with the leases that expired, the $20 million that came in that the member from Clayton Park was asking about earlier. That money could be used for other purposes. So it might be very attractive to the provincial government to sell those assets to the district authority, who would then finance them. Well, financing them, of course, is in a separate category all of itself. I mean, I suppose that you could just put them on the open market. You could I guess have a tender for them. You could say, what am I bid for the bridges? Because after all, with the bridges comes the right to set the toll. So, perhaps international financiers would look at this and say, here's a way to make a buck. We'll take the bridges off your hands. You can pass them on to the bridge authority. They'll finance the cost, and the province will make a tidy little sum on them, and then we'll increase the tolls, or perhaps the tolls are high enough now, or perhaps we'll defer the maintenance or whatever. But we'll look to make a profit on the money that we have invested, and we won't necessarily be looking for planning down the for the long haul. And I know certainly when I raised the possibility of selling these off privately, there was certainly one member of my caucus who said, well, if they want to sell the bridges, I'll buy them. Because you can't lose, here's my check, here's my ID, we'll just purchase them. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that might be well and fine for an individual to, or for someone with the means to do that. I don't know if my caucus member actually has the means to do that, but if they do, certainly it's in that category of no-lose propositions. because they simply just set the tolls to reflect an allowable level of profit that would come in. So, what I'm trying to stress here is that there are considerable difficulties that we foresee in this legislation that haven't been discussed, and I feel quite certain that although I've spent some time looking at this bill, and I'd reiterate what the member for Halifax Clayton Park said. I mean, it's just a shell, so there's not a lot to look at. But I look at all of the competing concerns that come from the communities around Halifax, Dartmouth, and I think to myself, why in the world would I, in the present position that I am in, turn over to the government that brought in Bill 68, the government that brought in the back to work legislation for paramedics, the government that brought in the pathetic insurance legislation, why would I want to turn over to them legislation which will essentially be a blank check for them to do whatever they want, right or wrong, with respect to something as important as the potential setup and design of a district transportation authority. It may be that through debate, it may be through it may be that when we hear the plan, maybe it's going to come forward in law amendments. I don't know, but certainly it may be that we will hear more about what the intentions of the government are. It may be that they will be prepared to bring forward by way of amendments to the Act the actual plan that will flesh out what the District Transportation Authority would look like, what the representation would look like, what their powers would be, what their mandate would be, what it is exactly that they're going to be looking after. Maybe all of that will be contained within amendments that will come forward from the government, and maybe at that point they will withdraw their request for regulatory power. And it may be that if that's the case, it may be that we will be satisfied. I'm not going to prejudge what's going to happen at law amendments. I can only say that when I look at the current act and I look at the potential for things to go wrong, in my mind, at least at this point, the potential for things to go off the rails at this point is far greater than any benefit that might accrue to the constituents of my area or to the constituents of the Halifax district. And I'm very respectful of planning, Mr. Speaker. I spent a long time working with community planning groups, was for many years a member of the Community Planning Association of Canada, worked, in fact, while I was at law school, by doing independent research papers for that organization. So I don't think anybody could accuse me of not caring about the proper planning of our city and of our region. It's something that I'm very concerned of, very cognitive of. Every time I see some of the problems that I have seen around the municipalities. I mean, I look at some of the industrial parks and they have no sidewalks and no bike paths, and they have no way for people to actually get around, and I think, how in the world did this happen? Where was the planning process when this was thought up? Certainly when I was on city council, when the city of Dartmouth existed as a corporate entity, as a chartered city, I spent a lot of time on each proposal as it came forward to see whether or not it fit into some kind of overall plan. And I have to say, and I think it's, although not directly on the point of this bill, it is an example which by comparison we should learn from, and that is the municipal development strategy, the municipal planning strategy, where there were strategies that were put in place by the municipalities, and then we would simply see them in a very haphazard manner amended, and whether or not the amendments made sense or not. And as a member of municipal council, you'd often, sit there and you'd think to yourself, this particular development or this particular amendment to that strategy is going to have a very significant impact on my area, and yet, even though I have pointed out that this amendment is going to do that, it goes ahead anyway, seemingly oblivious to the fact that there was a plan in place to begin with. So it is not the case that I am somehow opposed to regional planning. Much to the opposite, Mr. Speaker. I am simply and significantly concerned with the way in which the government would be able to exercise unfettered power over the question of the makeup of a transportation authority that stands to affect the lives of more than 300,000 people. I haven't seen any indication of what that plan is going to entail. One would hope, for example, that one of the things that would happen is that the questions of mass transit would start to get some attention on a regional basis.
Good idea.
Now, I hope sincerely that that's going to happen.
Who knows?
But that is not part of the bill. And I'll declare my bias in this. My brother is a bus driver for Metro Transit, I guess that gives me a bias. I don't know. But he's a member of a profession that provides a significant public service, one that ought to be expanded, and it ought to be done for many reasons. More than just the service itself, but in terms of cutting down on congestion, in terms of cutting down on greenhouse gases, in terms of our commitment to more friendly cities, all of those things are reasons why mass transit and the integration of the ferry system and perhaps commuter rail and the bus service all ought to be part of that strategy. But we have no idea from what's before us in terms of the regulatory powers that the government requests, whether or not that is in fact going to be part of that plan. So I don't think it's unreasonable for me at that to ask the government to explain itself with respect to this legislation. I understand that's going to be the end of my comments. I think I've had a pretty good go at this one, Mr. Speaker. I think that the government by this time should be aware of what my concerns are in relation to it. As my friend says, I'm sure this will spur them to action. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to speak to this bill, and in addition to setting down, or before I set down, I will move adjournment of the debate.
So adjourn debate on bill number 64. Is it agreed? Agreed. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This concludes the business of the House for the day. With the intent of moving on with late debate, I would like to recognize the NDP caucus to set the business for tomorrow and the hours.
The Honourable Member Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The hours tomorrow will be from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. And after the orders of the day and question period, we intend to call Bill number 104, which is a bill amending the Emergency Measures Act, and resolution number 2247, which deals with residential tenancies, and I move adjournment.
Motion is the House adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. We now reach the moment of interruption. Recognize the Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to stand on behalf of our caucus to speak on this resolution as the housing critic for our party. I've witnessed over the last year or so, after becoming the new member from elected member from Sackville-Cobequid and the housing critic at that time, that there's an increased need to bring awareness around the issue of affordable housing and homelessness here in our province. Therefore, there's 2 points in this resolution. One, that the government recognizes the affordable housing crisis, and 2, that there's an increased level of homelessness here in our province. So I'm going to speak on those 2 issues for a few minutes, Mr. Speaker. The first one I'm going to address is the increased level of homelessness here in Nova Scotia. Yes, it's definitely an issue not only here in our province but across Canada, and you don't have to look far to realize that there is...
Thank you. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You don't have to look far to realize that the importance of this issue across the country. Recently in the federal election, it was an issue that all parties addressed, especially the Prime Minister Martin, where his counterparts have recognized the need to increase their participation in addressing some of the issues of homelessness across the country and affordable housing. So getting back to the resolution on increased level of homelessness, you don't have to look far, Mr. Speaker, from this legislature here to see who's the ones at risk. There's a lot of youth in our city here in HRM that you see on the corner of many of our streets. People refer to many of them as the panhandlers and the squeegee kids that you see trying to raise funds to, for one, afford a proper housing or a proper place to put their heads down. The other thing, you don't have to go far if you want to use the term a stone throw from this legislature, is just down the street on Hollis Street, where we had the Tex Park building that was there. There was a service station in it, and it housed the parking for this area of the city for many years. But after they found that there was a need for more parking, but closed the building and boarded it up, we started to see reports in the media about squatters or homeless people living in that building down there. Right. And it seemed to bring the attention of their fight and their need to have affordable housing to the forefront and in the media, because of the pictures you've seen as the media walked around and seen the conditions that some of these youth especially were living in. They were deplorable. So I want to speak also that the government needs to recognize the increased homelessness here in the city, here in the province, on all levels. That building was owned by the municipality, and after the story broke with the squatters or the people inside this Tex building, they said they had to react, or they needed to do something about it. So you would think that they'd try to emphasize the need to get the squatters into a facility that could house them a lot better than what the conditions they've seen there. But how the municipality reacted to it was that we need to get rid of that building as quickly as we can, because they've seen it as a potential liability against the municipality if someone was to injure themselves or potentially maybe lose their life living in those conditions. So to me, the government needs to recognize and needs to come forward with better ideas than just to tear it down or board it up and put guards out front.
Put an armed guard in front of it. Put an armed guard in front of it.
You don't have to go that much further down the road, Mr. Speaker, to the old infirmary site, which our government here is the owner of. Right. And that also was publicized greatly in the papers, in the media, on the news, when the story broke, when we found that people were inside that facility, using that as their home or their place to lay their head. Again, the pictures were shown in the papers and on the news about the conditions of this place. Some questions about asbestos and other other effects or other environments that were danger for these people that were staying there. So what did our province do to curb that or try to address the people that were found in these homes? They boarded it up, and they hired a security firm and a security officer to stand outside. To me, to our caucus members here and to many Nova Scotians, that's not how you address the need and to keep the important people that are, or keep the residents of this place, of the hotel, at heart. We really need to make and really strive to address the issues of these people, not just to board them out, kick them out, and let them find other places to live. So with this resolution, you look at all levels of government need to address and need to recognize that homelessness is on the rise here. You don't have to go far. We have Angela Bishop, who's with the Community Action on Homelessness, has been a great proponent of and a great person to bring the cause of homelessness here to the city, to the province. And she has recognized that the increase, especially in our youth here in HRM, that are on the street, is growing every day. Right. And we need to do, what we need to do is address these issues, not just hide behind it and tear down buildings. I believe that the building is going to be torn down within the next year. So I think it's important that our government recognize that we need to develop a program so these people that are found in these areas have an area to go. I know there is transition houses and emergency shelters, but I think we need to increase that. The other point I want to make on the resolution was, of course, that this government recognizes the affordable housing crisis in this province, and I believe there is a crisis here in the province. The federal government realized that there was a crisis years ago and decided to get back into the affordable housing problem. What they did is went around the country and signed affordable housing agreements with the provinces, like our province did, and it showed that the federal government realized that we probably made a mistake by getting out of the affordable housing or the housing department and downloaded onto the provinces. So with this affordable housing agreement, it's important that we maximize every dollar that we have in this agreement. It's not often that the government has the opportunity to get $2 worth of product out of only spending $1. And I think that's the most important fact here, is that we can get something worth twice as much as what our money is worth with this agreement. What we need to do is disperse this money and address the serious issues of numbers of units in this province. We have heard from the minister responsible for housing state the numbers of houses that we're supposed to address, or the number of units. I think initially in the early stages there was 1,500 new units that were going to be addressed, but then they revised that and it was going to be 1,500 units addressed in the affordable housing agreement. And now we heard recently that there's going to be somewhere between 850 to 1,500 units being addressed in this affordable housing agreement, which I think it's important to address as many as we can. But one of the points that I want to make is that we need to really look at creating new housing units. The minister has stated in the past that maybe I had my figures wrong when I announced during question period. But if I stand here today, and if the minister were to take me out for a tour of the affordable housing, new constructed affordable housing units in this province, we'd have 21, Mr. Speaker. Yes, there is I know that there's an existing restoration program in effect that does affect many homes. But if you were to look at the interest groups like Angela Bishop, Paul Pettipaw from the Home Builders Association, they agreed with the announcement the minister made a couple of weeks ago. We agree with the announcements the minister made a couple of weeks ago. We have no problems with the restoration program and addressing rent subsidies. But we really need to address the number of new units in this province. We have tens of thousands of people in this province on the brink of becoming homelessness. And I think that's where we really need to look at developing and accepting proposals under this affordable housing agreement. We just got to look at a province north of us, like Quebec. They have addressed 6,000 units in their affordable housing agreement. We are 2 years into our agreement, and we have the numbers, about 89 new moderate to low income units completed or announced so far. That's right. Quebec not only addressed 6,000 units, but they also have a second agreement worth about $150 million. So I think it's important that the minister realize that there's more affordable housing agreements in the future, as long as we continue to address the needs of the people in the province today about affordable housing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for his comments. I also want to thank the member from Dartmouth North for bringing up the topic for debate this evening. It is an important topic in this province. It's one that I never get tired of working on. It's something that I think about constantly, always trying to find ways that perhaps we can do a little bit more than what we're doing yesterday. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has made reference to the size of the demand for affordable housing. Affordable housing, by the way, is defined in economic terms. Basically, if a family is spending more than 30% of their gross income on housing, on shelter, if you will, then they have an affordable housing program. So if you've got one family that is spending 31% of their income on housing, that's not a crisis situation, but it's not a good situation. If you've got a family that's spending 51% of its income on housing, that's a horse of a different color, and that is really something that needs attention. And indeed, that is what we are trying to do with the affordable housing program, is to target those that are in the most dire need of assistance. Actually, the federal program is tailored as a program to reduce the capital costs of getting a home. But the problem with that is that works very well if you've already got a decent income. If you're making $50,000 a year, a small mortgage buy-down will allow you to get access to a home which you might not have had otherwise, and perhaps you could do 1,500 units. The approach that we've taken, and I do appreciate the members acknowledging that he agrees that it's the right way to go, is with the rent subsidy approach. It allows us to target those homes, those families in greatest need, and we can do more good for them with the rent subsidy approach as the provincial contribution. Now, that does come with a cost. The cost is that at the end of the day, I'm probably not going to be able to get up here and say, geez, we did 1,500 units. But if I can get up here and say that we've done 1,000, which is about what we anticipate, and I feel that we've targeted that to 1,000 Nova Scotians that were in greater need, or 1,000 families that were in greater need, then I think that we have made a judicial use of those monies that were made available. The member opposite points out that that the federal government pulled out of public housing in 1993. They had their reasons, but it has come with a cost. And it is good to see that 10 years later that they recognize that perhaps they had made a mistake and that they should be getting back into it. And we welcome them back into it. It's not necessarily the way that I would have structured the program, but they are trying to please the entire country. We are responsible for trying to address affordable housing for Nova Scotians. Nova Scotia has some unique circumstances. The way that we've broken out the affordable housing program is that after doing research to take these limited dollars, because it is only $37 million, a big number, but by no stretch of the imagination enough to put a significant dent into the affordable housing challenge that we face in Nova Scotia. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not going to solve the problem. So we wanted to make sure that we got it right. And one of the things that I can share with members of the House and all Nova Scotians that are following this debate this evening is that 70% of Nova Scotians own their own home. That's a good number. That's better than the national average, and we should be proud of that as Nova Scotians. There is a caveat to that, though, and the but is that we also have an older housing stock that is in greater need of attention. And we do not want to lose that housing stock because some of the less affluent homeowners are not able to bring about the necessary repairs so that they can stay in their homes. So that's one of the reasons why we have the program, which we started last fiscal year and did 26 homes, and so far this year I've announced another 88 for 114, the Home Ownership Preservation Program, and about 20% of that $37.26 million is going to be going into that. And I think that that's a good investment. I think it recognizes the uniqueness of the challenge we face in Nova Scotia. And we're going to continue that right to the end of the program. Another area which we've addressed, but in a much smaller way, is a new home purchase program. And that's what we call the urban area revitalization. In essence, what we're trying to do there, Mr. Speaker, is we're trying to encourage people to build up some areas that might be losing some of its leaders because they're migrating out to other areas they see as being more attractive. That's what we try to do in the North End. I think that it's a good concept. This is the Creighton Garish project with the 6 homes. There were some, some things in the learning curve there, but we are going to put about 5% of that $37.26 million into that. But the area that we're really concentrating on is in the rental market, because even though only 30% of Nova Scotian families are renters, these are the people that have the greatest difficulty affording their rents. By far and away, the vast majority of those that are over 50% of their gross income fall into this category. And for that reason, 50% of the program money is going into the new rental housing initiative, which includes the 68 units that were announced earlier this week. And I appreciate the member opposite acknowledging the appropriateness of those announcements, and also acknowledging that this was just not a decision that was made by the Department of Community Services. We went outside and we asked for input from Community Action on Housing and also from the Nova Scotia Home Builders Association to try to get a balance there, and we'll continue to consult with them. And within the city, we also have representation on a committee from HRM. And they have some wonderfully caring people there that do understand the problem well here in the city. Also, the final 25% is going to the Rental Housing Preservation Program. This is something that probably caused me the most problems when I was told about it, because in essence, we're talking about working with, in some cases, established landlords whose premises may not be as good as we would like them to be, and perhaps are not as good as the municipalities expect them to be. But, Mr. Speaker, my responsibility is to help as many Nova Scotians in need. And if that means that we buy units, such as some units perhaps in Dartmouth North, which the member has spoken to me about, I'm not saying that they are going to be those units, and we renovate them and we bring them back into the housing stock and put them out at an affordable price so that citizens can afford to move into them, or we work with existing landlords. Anything we can do to upgrade the standards and out in those housing units, the rooming houses, I think Nova Scotians would agree is a step in the right direction. How are we making out, Mr. Speaker? Oh, 1 minute. Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I've only started on the first page of my notes. I will briefly say that the province has been involved in the issue of battling homelessness long before Skippy, the federal program, came to pass. The Metro Turning Point, I believe, is coming up in this incarnation of a former name to almost 25 years of service. The member opposite talked about caring for those people that were staying in the old infirmary when they were evicted a year ago in the wintertime, or I guess it was this past winter actually. I want to assure the member that the Salvation Army, the Metro Turning Point, there were beds available for these people. The numbers that were reported that were staying there were grossly exaggerated, and in fact it was only 2 or 3, and there was never anybody that was turned away that came to those doors for reason that there was not a bed available. And I want to thank the member for bringing it up. I hope we have a chance to continue this at another time.
Thank you. Recognize the member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and join in this debate, a debate put forth by the member for Dartmouth North. Therefore, be resolved, this government recognize the affordable housing crisis and increased levels of homelessness. And I rise in my place to speak to this matter, thinking that this is just another waste of time talking to this minister about anything to do with adequate levels of funding for those in need in this province, because he just doesn't get it, that there are people in this province that are hurting and continue to hurt under this Tory government. And that goes for people right across the province, not only in Metro Halifax, but in my own area of Cape Breton as well. Mr. Speaker, the federal government, much maligned by the minister and his colleagues, entered in good faith into an agreement in September 2002 to build affordable housing units in Nova Scotia and contributed $18 million to that process. The minister, however, who signed on for the province, gave assurance that the Nova Scotia government was eager to do its part and failed to live up to that promise. As a matter of fact, we learned last spring, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Finance, with the full support of the Premier, wrote to the Federal Minister of Finance to tell him that the province was no longer interested in participating in programs where they'd have to provide matching dollars. And what does that tell us, Mr. Speaker? Well, it tells us this government has no interest in addressing the concerns faced by low-income Nova Scotians and seniors who are desperately in need of safe, affordable housing. Or for that matter, Mr. Speaker, any other programs that come under the umbrella of the Minister of Community Services. We are now more than 2 years into that 5-year agreement, Mr. Speaker, and the province is simply not living up to its commitment. How this minister can stand and take any kind of pride in his department's accomplishments in the creation of affordable housing units is simply ludicrous. As a Minister of Community Services, one would hope that he would have some compassion for the difficulty far too many seniors and low-income Nova Scotians are facing every day due to a lack of safe, affordable housing. Unfortunately, it doesn't concern him at all. Let's take a look at the statistics, Mr. Speaker. In 2 years, this minister has managed to construct 21 units. Yes, he has promised more, but promises are easy to make. For example, in the spring budget, the government noted that promises made in February and March would not be completed until 2005. So where do we stand now, Mr. Speaker? Should we assume that in the next budget, we will find that the units he promised on the eve of this sitting may not be completed until 2006? And what of future promises? We know, Mr. Speaker, they are coming, and that's how this government reacts to criticism. He stands in his place in the House and he makes more promises. He simply makes another promise, and quite frankly, he's pretty good at that. But the difficulty with that is that the delivery doesn't accompany the promises. Mr. Speaker, the minister states that he cares about seniors and he cares about single mothers and their children. Well, I, for one, am waiting for concrete action on that statement. He continuously states that he cares for those in our province who are less fortunate than those in this House and other Nova Scotians, but we've yet to see any concrete action. We are almost halfway into a program that was designed to construct and repair 1,500 units in 5 years, and so far we have a total of 21 constructed units. 15 in Middleton and 6 in Halifax, one of which, by the way, went to a well-paid city councillor. And he didn't try to stop that process, nor did she have the wisdom to realize it was the wrong thing to do and step back from it. Both of them are at fault in that particular concern. But what's even more telling is that there are all kinds of single moms with children out there who could have used that unit. Yet the very unit was designed for safe, affordable housing for families was given to a single person making $52,000 a year, and the minister did nothing about it. And we talked earlier today during debate about what's happening with the housing program in Cape Breton. Absolutely nothing. We are still waiting for some of the units, many of the units in the Cape Breton Regional Housing Authority to be fixed to a point where people can actually inhabit them. And that's not happening. There are dozens and dozens of units down there, depending on where you're at in Glace Bay or Sydney or North Sydney or the county area, that are empty because they're in need of repairs, and there's no money being spent on repairs, let alone making new housing units available to people in our area. It's just not happening. Less than 2% of the promised units have been delivered, Mr. Speaker, less than 2%. Now, he's going to have to create 1,400 and something units in the next 3 years to live up to the agreement. He can stand here as much as he wants and tell this House and tell Nova Scotians that he's going to do that. But I know he's not going to do it, Mr. Speaker. You know he's not going to do it, and the members of this House know he's not going to do it, because the provision of affordable housing that will cost any provincial money in this province is simply not a priority of this government. This government does not concern itself with people who are on low incomes. It doesn't concern itself with people who have dependent children, single mothers. This government has stated time and time again they're doing everything they can for this group of people in our society that are less well off than we. But I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, those people need help. They need a compassionate Minister of Community Services that's going to get the job done for our fellow Nova Scotians who are out there hurting, whether it be in housing or whether it be in any other everyday needs that they have. It's not happening, Mr. Speaker. I would have hoped that perhaps this minister, when told time and time again that there's something missing in the delivery system of community services. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the Community Services Department has got into the hiring mode of hiring bean counters and bill collectors rather than social workers. At one time, the Department of Community Services had people working in there who actually cared about people, who actually went out of their way to try to help people in need, not to call them up and ask them to make repayments on overpayments and social assistance because they happen to be starving. That's what's happening in this province today. They're trying to claw back. They'll give millions away on a regular basis to businesses who can't afford to pay their bills. They'll just write it off. But to a community services recipient, they'll call them up and harass them for the money. That's simply not right, Mr. Speaker, and this government department needs a new direction. It needs to return to the direction of actually being a caring department in terms of the delivery system of housing in this province and the delivery system of community services to those of us in this province who are asking the minister to please deliver to this segment of our society that needs it. In regards to the housing, the previous speaker from the NDP was absolutely right. There are people living on the streets in one of the most affluent areas of this province in the year 2004. One would have thought that that would have been a thing of the past. Would have been a thing of the past. One would have thought that single mothers with dependent children having to return to school, Mr. Speaker, to try to get off of the public service system in this province, one would have never thought that they would be forced into substandard housing because available public housing was simply not there for them. And that's happening, Mr. Speaker, every day in my area. People are calling me. People are trying to go back to school. People are trying to provide decent housing for their children, and they have not been giving one incentive from community services to do that. Rather, they've been discouraged and told to go on their own way, and we're not going to help you, because you got yourself in this mess, you get yourself out of it. Well, Mr. Speaker, they'll never get out of it unless they get a helping hand from community services in this province. And I'm going to tell you, there are a number of young people out there who are hurting, Mr. Speaker. All they need is to have a caring, compassionate department of government that will look out for their needs, and that's simply not happening in this province. It's not happening with housing, and it's not happening with the delivery of social services to those who need it. Some of the meager amounts that are given out in this province today, most other jurisdictions would be ashamed of the treatments. For example, a maximum of $700 a month in some cases for somebody to live in this province. It's simply not enough, Mr. Speaker, but it would help if they were able to access an affordable housing unit at a reasonable rent from the government, like a rent that would reflect their income. But in this particular case, that's not available because the rental properties aren't available. So they're forced into substandard housing, paying $500 and $600 a month, and they shouldn't have to be doing that. But, Mr. Speaker, this minister and this government has got to go back to the drawing board when it comes to delivery of service and housing to those who need it in this province, and also has got to realize that everybody is not as well off as MLAs or the people that we deal with on a regular basis here in government. We have to return to the days where we had caring social workers running the Department of Community Services, and the Department of Housing has to be in a position, Mr. Speaker, to be able to help people and not be restrained by the kind of rhetoric that that might seem in some eyes to be politically popular. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, this kind of attitude towards those in our area that need housing will come back to haunt this minister someday. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The time allotted for late debate has expired. I'd like to thank the honourable members for taking part in the debate this evening. The House is adjourned until tomorrow at 2 p.m.